Hi there, John Wilkinson and History Made Easier. And for those IB students amongst you grappling with the TOK essay, here's a few thoughts I have on how history might be able to help you. In looking at the crux of the first question, can there be knowledge that is independent of culture? We can see that culture heavily influences the way we see the world, and so our knowledge of the world, our interpretation of events, their causes, how things unfolded and their outcomes. And so history provides almost endless opportunities for you with this question. Culture is most obviously important when studying social and political domestic policy. In modern history, for example, there is the culture of elites and where their notion of liberalism, with its emphasis on property rights and individual responsibility, stems from, as opposed to working class culture and its emphasis on community and cooperation. Or else there is the culture of imperialists clashing with that of indigenous populations, the culture of slave traders, slave owners, and of the slaves themselves, and the clash of cultures between African Americans and white Americans at any point in history, right up to the Black Lives Matter movement, which, though not history, makes my point. In America in the 1920s, I think of Prohibition or the monkey trial, and the clash of rural conservative American culture with that of urban culture. The backlash of the traditional conservative elites in Weimar Germany and that of the Nazis to the culture of Weimar's golden years. How can we properly understand Weimar Germany or the rise of the Nazis without knowledge of this clash of cultures? But war also throws up interesting points for the historian to consider. For example, it's important for historians of World War I or World War II to consider the culture of civilization and how that is suspended and overridden by the culture of war. Nazi culture, which delivered the orders, is important in understanding the nature of the war against the Soviet Union. And the Japanese culture of the 1930s is important in reaching an understanding of the nature of war in Southeast Asia. Another area I have studied, American involvement in the Vietnam War, requires historians to contrast the culture of the Viet Cong against that of the young American GIs, if a full explanation of why the war ended the way it did is to be given. Knowledge of the war and an understanding of its outcome would be incomplete without doing so. And in doing so, one could also consider the culture of white American youth and that of young African Americans with regards to the way they saw the war. These are just a few examples. You'll probably have many others. And so, to the second question, to what extent do you agree with the claim that there's a world of difference between truth and facts? It was Leopold von Ranke, possibly the most influential historian of the 19th century, who said that the job of the historian was to paraphrase him, to tell it as it was, i.e., to set out the facts and tell the story. Just about a century later, E.H. Carr in What is History talks of facts as being like fish on the fishmonger's slab. The historian collects them, takes them home, and cooks and serves them in whatever style appeals to him. In other words, facts are made to fit the argument he or she wants to present. To take a different tack, Eric Hobsbawm once wrote, unemployment is an economic statistic, in other words, a fact, but it is a human experience. The same can be said for any number of statistics or facts. They only tell part of the truth. Their impact on people, the human story, countless human stories, tell us much more. And I'll look at this a little bit more with the fourth title that you have. And a final take on this, for me anyway, for historians, facts or truth are actually not necessarily important. If we want to understand why things happened, we want to understand how people saw the world, what people believed, no matter whether it was based on facts or truth. If we want to understand the Nazis' view of the world, anti-Semitism for example, there's no point in looking for facts or the truth of the matter. The historiography of the causes of World War I offers fruitful material for this question, I feel, and so might be worth your attention. After World War I, the Treaty of Versailles and the Guilt Clause, German historians were busy telling it like they wanted the world to see it. And to be fair, so was everyone else. But the Germans had more cause to. Those reparation payments, for one thing. The German Foreign Office set up a war guilt section, which in turn financed, organised and directed 2 units. A working committee of German associations for combating lies concerning war responsibilities, not exactly a pithy title, and the more academic Centre for the Study of the Causes of War. There are no shortage of controversies in history, however, that will provide plenty of material for you to use. And so the third question, is there solid justification for regarding knowledge in the natural sciences more highly than any other area of knowledge? Well, first of all, it depends on what meaning we put on how you choose to regard knowledge highly or not. Is knowledge in the natural sciences more reliable than that in history? On the whole, yes. But that is not to say history is unreliable, nor that the natural sciences are totally reliable. But nevertheless, that could be a useful area for you to explore. But does reliability matter? What a can of worms that opens up. Isn't it important for us to learn, when it comes to things like histories, note the plural, that there is no monopoly on truth? Again, I would go back to the historiography of the causes of World War I. But you can take any number of historical topics, the history of empires, the history of slavery, the history of any number of wars, their causes, their nature, how they were won and lost, and 2, the history of individuals. Otherwise, once the history of an event has been written, or the biography has been written, why is there a need for others? You may say that for the natural sciences, as it affects the future of mankind, the bar should be set higher, thereby making the natural sciences more important. But isn't a people's culture important? And isn't this so whether it be the storytelling of the Aborigine or the storytelling of the American West or of the British people? And that these stories all involve myths as well as hard knowledge, facts if you like. Isn't that nevertheless part of the story, part of the history of a people, and so its culture? And here's another can of worms for you. Cans of worms are good for TOK. Is knowledge in the natural sciences more valuable than that in history? It helps us create medicines, build bridges, take people into space. Well, there is the quote from George Santayana that those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. Does history repeat itself? Take care with this, though. The context is always different. The individuals are always different. And yet we can learn from the past, or else we can't learn from anything. But we have to be open to doing so. Just as in this pandemic, we have to be open to accepting the science. And so, the fourth essay. How do historians and human scientists give knowledge meaning through the telling of stories? A theme I keep returning to in this TOK presentation is thinking about these questions as part of our culture, and history's part in culture. And stories are an essential part of culture. They keep culture alive. The nation's story, the story of a race, the story of a family, these are histories, and they are important. And that history is always about people is one of my mantras in history classes. But it's an important mantra, so I don't apologise. And so I return to another aspect of history that I've already touched on. The significance of statistics is made clearer when we consider the lives behind those statistics. So yes, unemployment is a human experience, and one that sucks. It means a loss of human dignity. It puts a great strain on the relationships between husbands and wives. It leads to depression and worse. Casualty figures in wars, revolutions and the like mean that parents have lost their children, wives have lost their husbands, or husbands their wives. Children have lost their parents. Those wounded may never have worked again. I cannot begin to think how those who survived wars, civil wars, famines, the Holocaust, Stalin's or Mao's collectivization or Mao's cultural revolution managed to get on with their lives. I think the strength of the human spirit is one of the great lessons history has to teach us. And so the fifth essay, how can we distinguish between good and bad interpretations? Well, history is all about interpretations, so this should be fertile ground for the historians amongst you. But we can distinguish different types of history, what we might call balanced histories that present alternative perspectives, different arguments as opposed to polemics, histories that set out to present a specific viewpoint or argument. So there are different histories and different history books. There are different ideological interpretations. For example, the Whig view that history is about the inevitable progress towards enlightenment and both individual and collective liberty, notably liberal democracy. Or there is Marxism. Indeed, Marx had thought he had solved the riddle of history. This perspective is also known as historical materialism. Don't be put off by the language, in which history is seen as a progression from primitive communism through different class-based societies in which one class dominates the others to a classless society. And so history should be seen in terms of the way in which class relationships play out. Marxist history is therefore seen as a form of determinism, i.e., history has been predetermined, or at least the paths it has taken have been constrained by class relationships. Another ideological approach to history would be feminist history that looks at the power relationships between men and women, whilst women's history highlights the roles played by particular women or groups of women in history. Then there are nationalist histories, British history, American history, etc., etc., which includes histories where nations change character radically. For example, Russia and the Soviet Union, or China and the People's Republic of China. And there are histories that try to explain an historical event from a nationalist perspective. And so we are back to the national interpretations of the causes of World War I, the German perspective, the Russian perspective, and so on. The great man theory in history, the great men were the decisive factor in whatever unfolded, is another approach historians can take. Thomas Carlyle is probably still the most well-known proponent of great man history. The likes of Bonaparte, Lenin, Stalin, Hitler, or Mao. There is also the biography and its role in history. Biographies place the individual at the centre of the story. Links to great man history. But good biographies will always do this in the bigger context of what was going on. And good biographies undertake a level of research and an evaluation of the evidence that would satisfy any historian. Probably the biggest concern is when biographers attempt some form of psychoanalysis of their subjects. Can we ever, as historians, get that much into the heads of historical figures? Biographies are also often written by non-historians. Not necessarily problematic, but something to consider nevertheless. So how do we distinguish the good and bad from these different perspectives? The obvious answer is in the quality of their evidence, the way in which they link the evidence and the degree to which they place their perspective within the bigger context. Historians try to tell the truth, at least all but the odd rogue. For example, the Holocaust denial of David Irving, though they may try to place an emphasis on their particular interpretation and the evidence that fits it. This brings us to the responsibility of their readers to be aware of the historian's known bias towards a particular perspective and to read widely. And so, to conclude, for this essay title, I come to the work of Hegel. Hegel is the philosopher that introduced us to the idea that our understanding of things, our search for the truth, develops best through the process of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. History often develops on just these lines, with each new perspective adding to our understanding. And so the last question. If we conclude that there is some knowledge we should not pursue on ethical grounds, how can we determine the boundaries of acceptable investigation within an area of knowledge? Well, history happened. Can we under any circumstances ignore it? In doing so, surely this doesn't make historians out to be publicists for evil, in actually exploring it. Surely this doesn't make historians out to be publicists for evil, wicked people, or for unacceptable ideas. Rather, to understand the racism of the past, for example, adds to our understanding of racism per se. To understand the plight of the African slave in the Americas helps us to understand the perspective of black African people living in the Americas today, or people of African origin living in the Americas today, be it in America, be it in Brazil, for example. The difficulty for the historian is not so much whether a topic should be studied, rather how it should be studied, and whether the historian should judge or how far she should judge. As for how accuracy is important, but without being sensationalist, let me make that clearer for you. As for the how, accuracy is important, but without being sensationalist. Just as our news bulletins today warn us if a news story might be upsetting, it is still the job of the journalist to speak the truth. So it is for the historian, and the truth requires illustration. As for the matter of judgment, Isaiah Berlin, in an essay titled Historical Inevitability, strongly argues that it is the job of the historian to judge Charlemagne or Napoleon or Genghis Khan or Hitler or Stalin for their massacres. Whereas B. Croce argues those who on the plea of narrative history bustle about as judges, condemning here and giving absolution there because they think that is their office of history, are generally recognised as devoid of historical sense. So two very different views for you there. And if the judgment the historian places on individuals is controversial, what of events? The terror of the French Revolution, the murder of the Romanovs, Stalin's purges and his Great Terror, Mao's Cultural Revolution. Were they in any way necessary? Were there acceptable justifications? Is saving the revolution a justifiable reason? And what of war? Can war ever be justified? Can slavery be possibly justified? And if not, how does the historian approach the topic? My examples above might find easier answers. But what of an event like the Industrial Revolution, the birth of modern life? Would we have our smartphones, our computers and smart TVs if that first industrial revolution in Britain hadn't kick-started the whole process? But peasants were driven off the land. The working conditions in the factories were cruel in the extreme and included child labour. The living conditions in the burgeoning cities were appalling. Yet the Industrial Revolution gets a much better spin than Stalin's or Mao's forced collectivization and state-driven industrialization. And there were contemporaries who fought against the worst of the consequences of that first Industrial Revolution. So, more to consider. Now, I would want to make clear that these are not the only way in which you can answer those top questions. They're just some suggestions from me that I hope are useful. If I was to sit down and do this again in a week or two's time, I might well come up with different ideas. There's no one way to answer your top questions, you know that. But I hope that these have been useful for you. So as always, I thank you for listening. Cheers and good luck.